How do you figure out a good fingering on this thing anyway? What's going on? It's Jason Heath, and finding a good fingering is a
life or death thing.
Well, maybe not really, but it feels like it's so important. So in this video, we're going to figure out fingerings for a slower excerpt, a faster excerpt, but also the universal rule of good bass fingering. So be sure to stick around for that. We'll start by taking a look at the famous Ode to Joy from the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and we have this available as a download in the description below if you want to follow along and put in your own fingerings. So let's start with what I think of as the most obvious fingering. Let's take a look at this. This is all in first position, what I have marked here, and there are some nice things about it. No shifting. That's cool. I don't like that. So this sort of illustrates some of the challenges and levels of the game to fingerings. This would be a great fingering, in my opinion, for someone starting out, because there's no shifting. Why would this not be a good fingering? Well, it's all about musical context, and anything that you're trying to figure out fingering for or trying to learn, I'd highly recommend listening to. And so if you listen to this and know where this is in the symphony, this is a very hushed moment where the cellos and basses are playing this super famous melody for the first time you're hearing it in the orchestra. And it's generally not very vibrated and expressive, so you don't hear usually or something like that. You hear this very sort of clean, pure sound. So that kind of works in first position, but the problem is this G string, open G, kind of jumps out. And anytime you go half step crossing strings, especially to an open string, you risk this sort of flanging effect, which is even worse in measures 10 and 11. You got this So I don't love that. So what we could do, and this is not necessarily what I would ultimately do, but we could do this. So how does that work? It's probably a little bit better now, at least for that. So if we start in measure 9, okay, cool. So I like that. That might be a level 1 fingering is what we started with. This might be a level 2 fingering. It's a little bit more intricate here. Now, when I've played this with professional orchestras, we don't go over to the G string at all. I never have anyway, and that makes for a more consistent sound. We're playing it all on the D string. So how do we do that? That's the question. We could start on 4, and let's just take a look at that first measure. Do we start in first position and do this? Possibly. 4, 1, 4, 4, 1, and then we go to 4? Maybe. Maybe. Okay, now, what I don't like about that is I am having to go a long distance for a half step, 4 to 1. So that's a little dangerous. So what I could do is, and this is the tricky thing with fingerings, there's not a right or wrong answer. There's it's always a trade-off. So there's like maybe a less good option or a better option, but a lot of it depends on your level as a player too. So what if we did this? Now, I like that, but if you're listening closely, you could already hear that wasn't super in tune on my part. So I have to practice very. And I still have that 4, that 1, in this case, 1 to 4 shift going back. There's not really a great way to avoid that. I mean, you could go like. But now we're introducing like 1-1 shifts. So you kind of got to pick your poison and go with it. I do what is marked here on the first 2 bars, but I also have played around with starting on 4. I just find for me that little gloopity gloop from 4 to 1 is less desirable than the sort of like funkiness of playing around with. So I'll put in what I ultimately have chosen. There are many fingering options for this, and that first one that I put in, it's a good fingering. Depending on your level, it could be the perfect fingering for you. Here is my final fingering, the one that I do unless I am asked to do something else in an orchestra, and I will put a non-handwritten version, a little cleaner and easier to read, in that PDF in the description below. To me, that's a great example of how challenging bass is. As I'm playing through this, I'm giving myself like a 6 out of 10, maybe 7 out of 10. I'm hearing little bleeps and bloops and things I don't like, and little intonation things, and little like things poking out. So if I were to work this up for something, a concert or an audition or something like that, I would start recording myself and listening for that and analyzing the bow and the left hand, trying to be as smooth as possible. But this fingering to me is a good place to start for like a level 3 fingering. Maybe you're playing in a professional orchestra or auditioning for professional orchestras. So level 1's cool, level 2's cool, and level 3 is cool. The next example gives me nightmares. This is Mozart's Symphony number 35, the last movement. This thing is breakneck speed. I will not play it breakneck here. This one's a little more complicated, so I'm just going to show you some do's and, in my opinion, don'ts. There are no hard and fast rules, but probably some things are good to avoid. For example, I would really highly recommend not doing that as a shift, because you could play right here. Or even here. Although my preference is here. There's a little shift, but I'm trying to avoid big shifts. And again, it's all about musical context, composer, time period. Mozart, we're going for clean. We're not looking for big, romantic, scoopy shifts. This is done with the string section right here, so you want to make sure that you're blending with everybody else and nobody else is going to be making a big shift. So a string crossing is a good idea in my opinion right here. And a good rule of thumb for fingering is that if you have something with a similar type of musical context, try to do a similar type of fingering. So these first 2 bars, and again, I'm already hating my playing as I pull these out. If I were going to work this up, I would really try to work on that connection. And that's one of the disadvantages of this fingering is that going from a higher string to a lower string is really, really challenging to do without having a little bleep or bloop in the sound or a little hiccup. So you see some people doing this. By the way, I think that sounds the best. Now, does that look a little peculiar? Maybe, depends on what you're into. And if you're standing, like I'm doing for this video, it's a little tricky to do these low thumb positions. I'm generally sitting down when I'm playing this piece in an orchestra, so yeah, sometimes I do this, but sometimes with the whole ensemble, it's okay to have that little bit of a micro blip in the sound. I mean, I want smooth if at all possible. So when I've auditioned, I've often done this just to really have the smoothest sound. But in orchestra, I just kind of try to roll my finger across. Now, if you're new to the bass, well, if you're new to the bass, hopefully you're not playing this piece. But if you're relatively new to the bass, you might have the instinct of playing open string and then 4 on the C sharp. But just like the first example with the Beethoven, we're getting this flange. Especially, you know, right there. So I like, and I think most people like, close, close. And that low open A is cool, or you can close it too if you want. Either way, whatever sounds best on your bass. Now this next lick, which is something that any bass player who's trained orchestrally has spent some time figuring out. It's just a 1 octave D major scale. How can a 1 octave D major scale be tricky? Well, it's where Mozart put in these little jumps. So we have. Now, if you're really new to the bass, you might have the instinct to do this, which will cause all sorts of muscle spasms in short order. So I, and probably most people, would recommend this kind of idea. then the last part of measure 10 right there, we have to figure out, probably going back to the D string, right? Now I've got this little pivot or shift, whatever you want to do. For me, I generally pivot for this from the A to the F sharp because it's just right there, and so I go. Now you might hear, I haven't practiced this in a long time, so there's that, but even so, you might hear that it gets a little bit fuzzy at the end, and that's because 4 is not necessarily the cleanest of fingers on the bass. 2 is my finger of choice, followed by 1. You know, if I could pick a finger, I wish I could have all second fingers in my hand. That'd be weird looking, but interesting. So again, that thumb can come into play here. For auditions, I have done this. But I think of that as like a pro fingering. If I was sitting down in the orchestra, a lot of the time, I don't care that much how I look, but it can look a little bit funny. And I find that with practice, that's almost as clean. So I'm going to mark that, but know that there is, again, no right or wrong fingering. There are easier and more challenging fingerings, but also it's where are you in your musical journey? That's going to affect the fingering you do. In 14, we have another one of those GF sharps. So were we to do it in first position, we would have a couple of horrible things happen to us. We get the most flangey of flange between these two, and we would all of a sudden have a crazy string crossing. So I don't think I would advise that. I would probably do it over there, maybe. But if we do this, we're set up for our next spot. So this is an example of, and then, now we could also, again, these are the subtleties of fingering. 4-2 is not my favorite half-step fingering. We could go 2-1. But then we have a bigger shift. So that's what we're going to weigh, right? It's a little bit tricky. So I'm going to weigh on the favor of smaller shifts today for whatever reason. It's generally what I do with this excerpt. And there is a thumb variant of this that I have seen that I think I've tried an audition. Something like that. But I find that that's like, ugh. That's a little too much low thumb for my for my taste. And now in measure 20, we have the infamous little snaky thing. There's actually a part that we orchestral bassists call the snake that I'm not showing you today. And now this, at the very end, I'm going to actually bracket off just because I think this is an important little detail here. So we're looking at 20 and 21. This is the thing that sends bass players to the practice room. So I'm going to go slow. So we have that. There's that challenge of going 4-4 across the string. And then I'm going. Now why don't I just go? Because that's like way too many 4s in a row. So these last 4 notes. And my recommendation for a lick like this is start slow and just try not to build up any tension. I probably need to follow that advice myself for this. And a great way to sort of remember, this is a speedy excerpt, so a great way to practice this sort of thing is to so you're kind of getting your bow used to moving at a faster pace, and just 4 times in each one of the 8th notes. You can start way back in measure 9 with that. Okay, here's that secret rule. Find a fingering that's reliable and that sounds good. So this is like a 2-part rule. It's easy to get theoretical with fingerings and sit down and kind of put on your bass professor hat and try to figure out something, but if it doesn't hold up under pressure, it's not probably the best fingering for you right now. And if it doesn't sound good, that's not great either, right? Because in the end, you and the audience want to hear something that sounds not crazy, frantic, and with good tone. So there are fingerings that may be like way over here, you know, on these strips, but if it doesn't sound good, maybe it's not the right fingering. And if it's something that just falls apart under pressure, it's probably not the best fingering for you right now. We got more about the rules of good fingerings here, so check it out. We'll see you there.